So our first speaker is a full-time college and graduate school instructor of Core Jesu College teaching campus journalism. Okay. And he integrates CSJ when he teaches campus journalism, no, in his school at Corresu College. He is also one of the authors of our teaching guide on, and also one of the authors on the teaching guide on integrating peace education, which is also published by Forum ZFP. So please, let's give a round of applause to Sir Lorenzo Balili.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ma'am Jill. I am Enzo, no? But my full name is Lorenzo Balili Jr. But anyway, Ma'am Jill mentioned earlier that part sa kanya presentation that on the realities that peace is too abstract. That reminds me of one of my students when I was still integrating peace education in the professional education, no? In the College of Education. One of my students used to tell me na mahirap daw talagang pag-usapan ang konsepto ng peace. Bugal-bugalo ni siya nga bata. Ko, bakit naman? Kasi sir, sa pag-usap-usap namin grupo, sabi ng iba, ang English po daw ng isda ay peace. Ang English po daw ng mukha ay peace din. Pati po yung kalayaan, no? Yung kalinaw is peace. Pati po daw yung ihi, sir, peace. Teka lang, tapos na ba yung ano ninyo, yung gagawin ninyong portfolio for women in peace building? Ay, hindi pa sir. O sige, gawin niyo muna bago ako ma-peace off. Anyway, peace be with you. Peace be with everyone here present. So let me now share my first presentation, no? My first presentation kasi ang dami kong i-present today. Dalawa pala. Anyway, kita na ba siya, Ma'am Jill?
Yes, sir. And turn it
Okay.
into the reading mode.
Okay, okay na po ba?
Yes.
Okay,
That's it.
so nawala man po ko. Balik ta ha. Asa naman to? Ito na. Okay, so I am your facilitator in laying down the foundations in conflict sensitivity, peace building, conflict sensitive journalism, peace journalism, and conflict sensitivity and peace promotion. Before we proceed, I am giving you 20 cents as an investment of this particular lecture. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to check how much does your 20 cents gain, no? In our sharing of insights. Where do we go from here? So here are our objectives for this presentation. We need to distinguish the difference between conflict sensitivity and peace building, demonstrate understanding of the basic concepts of culture of peace, and this can be manifested later in our sharing, manifest adequate grasp of the fundamental concepts of conflict-sensitive journalism and peace journalism. Magkakaroon tayo ng paghahambing. And of course, we need to define conflict sensitivity and peace promotion communications. Okay. For our subtopics, of course, based on our objectives, ito yung ating mga topics, subtopics, conflict sensitivity and peace building, culture of peace, conflict sensitive journalism and peace journalism, and conflict sensitivity and peace promotion, or CSPP. By the way, do you know who this guy is? This great guy. Anyone? Ma'am Jill will point out, no, anybody who's raising a hand and share something. Who is this guy?
Sir.
Who is this great guy?
Mahatma Gandhi, sir.
Okay, Mahatma Gandhi. Any related matters on peace and conflict you could associate with this great guy? Yung matandaan nyo lang tungkol kay Mahatma Gandhi. Meron bang nagtaas ng kamay, Ma'am Jill, to share something? Ano yung matatandaan ninyo na talagang very famous si Mahatma Gandhi? O anything na matatandaan niyo tungkol kay Mahatma Gandhi?
From MSU, Miss Georgie Kampungan answered here in the chat, civil, non-violence, disobedience.
Okay, and that is also popularly known as active non-violence, no? Actively part and yet in a non-violent way. Thank you, ma'am. Isa pa, pwede pa, isa? Aside
Sir,
from
pwede po
active,
ba?
yes, go ahead.
I think po aside sa civil non-violence disobedience po, I think Mahatma Gandhi is also known for the quote that he inspired up until today, no, yung kanyang influence po is, sabi niya po, an eye for an eye will just make the world blind.
Okay. Sino po ito, ma'am? Hindi ko kasi makikita ang name ninyo.
I'm
From what
Joji po,
school?
sir.
Okay,
MSU
thank
po.
you. Thank you, Ma'am Juji from MSU. No? So, thank you very much for those insights sa lahat ng mga nag-participate. Now, one also thing na contributed by Mahatma Gandhi about peace and conflict is that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to cope with it. Kasi nga sabi kanina ni Ma'am Jill, peace is abstract, no? Mahirap siyang panghawakan, mahirap siyang makita, mahirap siyang marinig, but there are manifestations of peace naman, no? But then again, conflict is there in the midst of peace, no? Kaya lang in this case, hindi natin pababayaan yung conflict, hindi natin dinidedma si conflict, but we should have this ability how to cope with this conflict in the midst of that so-called abstract peace, no? Para ma-concretize naman natin yung peace, no? So, ito yung kanyang famous quote na hinahanap-hanap ko talaga kung sino ang rightful author nito kasi marami akong nababasa tungkol dito at ilang beses lumalabas talaga si Mahatma Gandhi, no? I'm trying to be very careful, particularly so that we are now engaged in fact-checking, no? Anyway, welcome to conflict sensitivity. According to the research pack on conflict-sensitive approaches, conflict sensitivity is the ability to understand the context. Take note of the word context. It's a kind of situation where the conflict is in which they operate. Saan ito, ang conflict na ito? No? Understand how interventions interact with the context. Tama kaya yung mga ginagawa doon sa situation ng conflict? And act upon the understanding of this interaction in order to avoid negative impacts and maximize positive impact. Yeah. To make the long story short, na hindi natin paabutin na yung conflict na yun ay magiging violence. According to Collaborative for Development Action, or CDA, focusing on conflict issues is not the main concern of conflict sensitivity. Kung puro lang tayo nakatutok sa issue ng conflict, but rather on the anticipation of consequences. Ano ang posibleng mangyayari of any program or intervention in a given context? Tama kaya yung mga ginagawa natin in the context of conflict and the measures to address those consequences. Pero kung may mangyayari naman, tama din kaya yung gagawin natin after. Woodrow and Shigas said there is a maximalist approach in conflict sensitivity. Maximalist. No? This is when the focus also gears towards addressing the root causes of conflict. No? Kumbaga, hindi lang natin pinutol yung sanga, pinutol yung puno, do bawal magputol ng puno, but if you don't want that, kasi may mga tanim din naman na nakakasira sa ibang pananim natin, no? But to really address that, kailangan nating hukayin talaga and we go into the roots, no? The root causes of conflict and contributing to achieving peace in the society. So, how to address is to go into the root causes. According to Conflict Sensitivity Consortium, conflict refers to parties disagreeing and acting on the basis of perceived incompatibility. Mura ra gid sila kuan kanang mag-uyab, no? Dili ta compatible, magbulag ta. Diha ka diri ko. Mura gid ana lang, no? There has to be compatibility for the relationship to prosper. But in this, dito sa conflict na tinutukoy natin, parties disagreeing and acting on the basis of perceived incompatibility. Mark Anstey, South African conflict specialist, he said conflict exists in a relationship when parties believe their aspirations cannot be achieved at the same time or perceive divergence in their values, needs, or interests. Later, pag-usapan natin itong mga naka-enclose parenthesis, no? Latent. And purposefully mobilize the power that is available to them in an effort to eliminate, neutralize, hindi makakilos, or change each other to protect or further their interest in the interaction. At dito sa mahalagang tignan natin dito sa definition ni Mark Anstey, dalawang phases of definition of conflict, no? Latent and manifests. This is to acknowledge that conflicts can exist in a latent or concealed state for a period of time until one party takes steps to change the situation. Parang suddenly nagkita kayo today, then nung nagkita kayo, parang may na-recall, no? Parang may nabuhay na nakaraan. At yung nakaraan na yon may mga unresolved na mga interest, unresolved na mga issues, kaya muli siyang bumalik. No? At dahil dyan, when the issue is finally talked about by the people involved, the conflict becomes manifests. Later, meron tayong pagkikilala itong mga uri ng conflict. Dalawa dito, si latent conflict and manifests conflict. So madali lang naman, no? Si latent, ito yung unresolved, and suddenly, in the present, when you are confronted with the same situation involving the same parties, parang babalik yung nakaraan na unresolved. Kaya, pinag-usapan, ang conflict ay nagiging manifests. There are several root causes of conflict. Sabi natin kanina, to really address conflict, we go to the roots. One is massive poverty. Another, unequal distribution of wealth. Poor governance, corruption, injustice, marginalization of indigenous communities. If you look at this, no, hindi naman ito mga physical or mga direct, no, na mga bagay-bagay. No? This connotes that conflict is not limited to direct violence, which consists of physical and psychological attacks on individuals, according to Resource Pact. The concept of conflict is so wide that the Resource Pact uses context. Tignan natin ang context. We need to understand the context. Huwag tayo kaagad birada diretso, no? Atake diretso without knowing the context. In the definition of conflict sensitivity, rather than conflict itself, it claims that conflict should be used with caution since it might be confused with macro-political violence between two warring parties. Parang ano lang, Ukraine versus Russia, no? So parang hindi we need to more or less differentiate this from macro political violence, no? So conflict has to be understood according to its context. Violence exists in different forms, and the most common of which is physical violence. Ito yung palagi nating nakikita, ito ang laman ng mga diaryo, ito naririnig natin sa radyo, ito yung mga nakikita natin, naririnig sa TV. But Johan Galtung added to the list, no? Other than physical violence, meron din tayong tinatawag na structural and cultural violence. Structural violence happens when there is an unequal opportunity for basic human needs, which therefore results in hunger, poverty, and even deaths. Parang sa barangay lang natin para mas madali nating maintindihan. Kung yung ating barangay captain ay hindi kaalyado ng mayor, tingala na lang tayo, no? Nagtataka tayo bakit yung neighboring barangay natin talagang nag-i-enjoy sila sa mga basic social services madaling nakarating sa kanilang barangay. Samantalang sa barangay natin, ay bakit tayo naghihirap, no? Bakit yung mga basic social services hindi nakakarating sa atin? Structurally, merong tinatawag dyan na political aspect, no? Kasi nga hindi kaalyado ng mayor, yung ating barangay captain, no? Bantay lang ka unyag ma-mayor ko. Wala ka ni support sa kuha, bantay ra mo unya og ma-mayor ko. So ito na ngayon, no? So ito na ngayon siya. Okay. Whereas cultural violence, which occurs when people hold the same beliefs that uphold violence in its direct or structural forms, such as sexism, racism, and discrimination. And we allow this to happen at okay lang kung mangyari, okay lang sa atin, tinatanggap natin, nagiging way of life, no? Nagiging kultura. No? But then again, it's a form of violence we call cultural violence. Tinatanggap na natin. No? Tulad ng korupsyon. No? Dahil tinatanggap natin na okay lang, wala tayong ginawa, hindi tayo nagsasalita, nagiging kultura siya. Nagiging way of life siya. Even in our small barangay, merong corruption, there is cultural violence, and dahil dyan, merong structural violence. So ito yung mga ibang uri ng violence na hindi natin nakikita right there and then. There is this what you call do no harm approach, no? Para in studying conflict, in facilitating conflict sensitivity. Do no harm. This approach aims to assess the conflict context, such as dividers and connectors. May mga barriers at merong mga tulay, and the unintended negative impact of an intervention. It enforces the goal of conflict sensitivity to help minimize negative effects and maximize the target positive effects of an intervention. Maganda ang konsepto ni do no harm. Again, titignan natin, may dalawang driving forces si do no harm. One is dividers, factors that create division or tension or mga barriers. Then connectors, ito naman yung mga factors that pull groups together. Paano natin siya itutulay? Paano natin siya pagdudugtungin? How are we going to bring them together? According to Haider, he classified religion as a divider, but explains that it is not necessarily a source of tension. Divider in a sense na iba-iba naman talaga, no? Sa relihiyon, kung makikita natin, no, kung saan-saan may mga rally-rally sa mga parke, no? Isang relihiyon nakipagtunggali sa isang relihiyon at may mga konsepto sino ang totoong relihiyon, no?
Okay, I think Sir Enzo is having a little bit of technical problem. Okay, so let's just wait a couple of minutes. We'll just check this. Okay, meanwhile, how's everybody? Are you already getting some important points from Sir Enzo's lecture? So far, what have been the very interesting new things that you have heard so far, like new concepts that you have heard so far? Anybody? Let me ask. I see some familiar people. Okay. So far, no, Sir Enzo mentioned about latent and open conflict. So what we are seeing right now in Ukraine is an example of an open conflict, no, when there is really an all-out war. But every day, okay, there is always latent conflict brewing, okay, in many situations. And it is important, no, so one of the things that conflict sensitivity teaches you is when you're able to when you're sensitive or when you use the tools to analyze this, then you can prepare yourself or you can help mitigate conflicts that are still latent into becoming open conflicts. Okay, so example would be, there are some conflicts in the workplace or even in families. So very important that when you are understanding, okay, a certain issue that's brewing within parties, Sir Enzo mentioned a while ago that it's all about context, right? It's context from coming from the different parties. So especially here in Mindanao, di ba? So as I mentioned earlier, that the context of peace is so different from Luzon, so different from Visayas and Mindanao. So when you are in Luzon, you're not very much aware of conflicts in resources, for example, among indigenous peoples, right? Or the context of, for example, in with our Muslim brothers and sisters, yung mga rido, mga ganyan. So these are all so unfamiliar to them. So exposure to a diverse culture, diverse set of culture is also very important in understanding conflict. So okay, um, can I ask somebody to like give a feedback on so far what they think is usual, what was their initial perception of peace? When you hear about peace building, what's the picture like for you? May I call, sorry, tawagin ko yung mga ano ha, yung mga hindi nag on ng cam. Okay, let's call somebody from, okay, can I call on Mr. Edgar Olinari, PWC, from Davao. Let's hear, PWC is Davao, right? Tama ba
Yes
ako?
po. Thank you po,
Yes,
ma'am.
okay, PWC. Sige, may here, kasi you're from Davao, so let's see, no? Let's hear from you. So far, when you talk about, when you hear the word peace building, okay, what's the concept for you?
For me, ma'am, for me, please, it is hard to define because conflict is really existing in our community and even in our country. And I think peace building for me, siguro ma'am, it's about making making a uh, naglisod yung kung understand. Okay? Para lang ma'am. The question is what is peace building ma'am, no?
Yeah, yung
So
perception mo.
peace building ma'am is making solutions to a certain problems. Sabi nga ni Sir kanina, there are two types of conflict, no? And I think yung latent and manifest. So these are the things that we could pwede Bisaya o na lang nako.
Sige, sir.
Or
And then we will translate for our participants
okay.
from Manila.
Uh,
Yes.
yung peace talaga kasi ma'am ay mahirap talaga siyang intindihin kasi nag-i-exist kasi yung conflict sa ating kapaligiran, no? So pag sinasabing peace building is kung paano mo or how you will become an agent to resolve that conflict in that community or people. For example, ang sinabi ni Sir kanina, for structural violence, these are an equal opportunity, no? That is really existing or evident in the community. Yan talaga yung problema. Ang paano ba pumapasok sa peace building doon? So in a way na meron tayong we can communicate or we can do peace talks, no, para ma-resolve yung problem. Pero I don't know ma'am kung tama yung nasa isip ko, but I hope it helps to understand peace building.
Yes.
Thank you po ma'am.
Yes. And that is okay. And that's precisely why we're having this workshop. Because mahirap talaga siya intindihin, no? And tama ka, no? This I pulled out Sir Enzo's slides here. Okay, para siya makabalik. Maybe he is having a technical problem. But to review here, he said there's latent and manifest conflict, okay? So when you say manifest, no? So when the issue is finally being talked, kaya nagma-manifest na. But it doesn't mean that it has already like blown out of proportions. It's already manifesting, meaning it's already coming out from underneath. Okay. And so this is when now interventions and conflict resolution skills should be abound. Okay. So now this connotes that conflict is not limited to direct violence. Okay. So which consists of physical and psychological attacks on individuals. No? So the concept of conflict is so wide that the resource pack, okay, on peace building, no, uses context in the definition of conflict sensitivity rather than conflict. Okay, so hindi ginagamit all the time yung word na conflicts. We want to look at context instead. Okay, so it claims that conflict should be used with caution since it might be used with macro political violence between two warring parties. So this is what I was telling a while ago, that the term conflict is often misunderstood. Okay, so before we use the term conflict, let's talk about context first. Okay, so that's the important thing. So here, violence exists in different forms. So the most common of which is physical violence. Okay, no, so of course you all know physical violence, domestic violence, child abuse. So when you physically hit someone, road rage, also when something is really like very visibly violent, okay, that's physical violence. But Johan Galtung, okay, 1969 added that there are actually two other kinds of violence, and these are structural and cultural violence. So what is structural violence? So this is structural violence, no? This happens when there is an unequal opportunity for basic human needs, right? So ito na. So what is this? When, for example, okay, resources are being grabbed, okay, from their rightful owners, okay, from IP groups, from marginalized communities, from marginalized groups, okay. So there is structural violence because there is unequal opportunity. Okay, so and then cultural violence, okay, which occurs when people hold the same beliefs that uphold violence in its direct or structural forms such as sexism, racism, and discrimination. So, sa tingin nyo saan nakikita itong structural violence? Of course, we see this a lot. We hear this on the news, okay? But often, what is often reported on the news, yung resulta na nung violence, resulta for example, nung rally, ilan ang nasugatan, or they will show bloody pictures of those protesters. But media lacks in, has a gap in explaining why did that happen. Bakit ba nagrarally yung mga tao? Bakit ba sila galit, no? So that structural violence should be understood, okay? And then cultural violence, okay, this happens a lot right now on social media when there is sexism, racism, and discrimination, no? So, and there is even reverse racism, yung tinatawag nila reverse racism, di ba? Na yung mga, for example, if you're African American, and then you would be prejudiced against Caucasians, the white people, okay, for the lack of a better term, about white people, and then yun, for example, you're smart shaming, diba? Because before yung mga not so intelligent are the ones being bullied, but right now there's like a reverse prejudice against people who are doing critical thinking, so that's what we call smart shaming. So now racism is can happen on both sides, okay? So discrimination happens on both sides, and sexism right now with a very diverse um, concept of gender, which we will talk about later. No, so there is going to be cultural violence there. So do no harm. Okay, so this approach aims to assess the conflict context, such as the dividers and connectors, and the unintended negative impact of an intervention, which this enforces the goal of conflict sensitivity, no, to help minimize the negative effects. So ano ba itong two driving forces? Dividers and connectors. So the dividers are the factors that create division or tension. Okay, and the connectors are those that pull groups together. So one, again, religion is a divider. Okay, unequal infrastructure, di ba, is also a divider. Okay. On the other hand, uh, connectors can be, these can be civil society, okay, and then NGOs. Okay, well, that's also part of civil society. NGO is a form of civil society, and other interventions. Okay, so the benefits of do no harm approach. Okay, so enabling communities and agencies to learn and speak a common language, in particular, in the language of connectors and dividers. So by doing a do no harm approach, no, we can support careful and well-designed non-divisive resource transfers. Okay. So ano tawag dito? No? So there's a system to this do no harm approach. No, there is we can, for example, we can think about methods of distribution. Okay, if we're thinking of unequal distribution, so we have to make look at allocation decisions. And then when we do a do no harm approach, you're also strengthening legitimate local groups and institutions, no? So the do no harm approach is usually adopted by this what we call peace building groups, okay, and what we call civil society organizations. Okay, but there are limitations of the do no harm approach, no? So incomplete organizational commitment and incorporation of do no harm approach in an organization as a racial agenda. Ano ibig sabihin nito? So a lot of times when you talk about development, no, you'll be surprised that a lot of development doesn't go through a systemic conflict analysis, meaning they just go on and plan a development project, okay, but there was no analysis done on sino ba yung mga apektuhan, who is going to be marginalized, in the process of this development. Are there resources, natural resources that will be destroyed? Okay. So because for the sake of development, usually talaga the do no harm approach is often um parang disregarded. Okay. So when we say do no harm, that means everybody, okay, in the sphere of the sphere of whatever's going to be affected, okay, should be considered. And a lot of that, it goes back to the reason of there's a lack of collaboration among agencies. And why is that? Because conflict sensitivity or conflict analysis is not a common practice, okay, among organizations. So Goddard observed that efforts to create new connectors between groups have not been effective and might result in making tensions worse, diba? Because let's face it, interests, no, of different parties, okay, will always clash. So due to this, organizations should focus on enhancing existing connectors. So when before the ideal setting is that when development is being planned, kailangan intervention or communication relationships must be built, okay, among the stakeholders first. And the development should be communicated properly. Okay, so it should not be, okay, I don't care who's going to be losing their houses as long as we put this airport. Diba? So if this airport needs to be built in this area, what do we do? Okay, with these people. So commonly we see that these people are going to be thrown away into a far-flung place, very far from their workplaces. And and that is not that is still doing harm. So even if you provided a house, even if you provided a new place for them to stay, but if it affects their way of life, then you're creating harm. Okay. So distinction between conflict sensitivity and peace building. Conflict sensitivity tries to minimize the negative impact of interventions on conflict, while peace building seeks to reduce the root causes of conflict. So conflict sensitivity is more on analysis, okay? While peace building is now doing or managing the relations or nurturing the relations, okay? So peace building is a set of measures aimed to strengthen institutions, okay, in sustaining peace and to reduce or prevent violence. Okay? And while to strengthen both effectiveness of peace building practice and the ability of development, humanitarian, and other programming to minimize negative and maximize positive impacts on conflict. So again, also conflict sensitivity is about analysis. So you have to analyze first, where is the conflict happening here? Before I speak, is there something that I am harming? Okay, before we plan, are we harming something? And so once you've analyzed that, then we know where peace building should come in. Okay. So that's why we can never really talk about peace, okay, if we haven't thought about the conflict yet. Okay. So the comparison between conflict sensitivity and peace building. All right. So conflict sensitivity, it refers to the ability of an organization to understand the context in operating particularly in intergroup relations, while peace building refers to measures designed to consolidate peaceful relations. So I Explained that already earlier. Okay. So the main aim of conflict sensitivity is to minimize negative and maximize positive impacts, while the main aim of peace building, okay, is to work on conflict, seeking to reduce key drivers of violent conflict and to contribute to peace. All right. Okay. So the culture of peace, no? This is an integral part. So pag sinabi nating culture, what does it mean? So it's not just a set of guidelines, it's not a set of rules. Culture is so embedded. And that is like innate. Okay, it's a collective identity. It's not just one person. It's a collective consciousness, no? So, what is the culture of peace? So, if there is, like we'd say, if there are really a societal norm, meaning we have normalized violence. Okay, we have normalized speech, hate speech. Okay, on social media, we have normalized saying sige, ano ka kasi, parang ganyan ka kasi, buti nga sa'yo, di ba? Yung mga ganyan. No? So, that means that we are living in a culture of violence because those are violent words, no? When we say hateful words to each other on social media. It's so easy to say hateful words on social media because we don't see their faces. No, we can hide from behind the screen. And that really is the opposite of the culture of peace. So this is really an integral approach to preventing violence. But this is a big problem because how do we address the conflict or the culture of conflict? No? So that is very systemic, okay? And we have to do a conflict analysis. Saan ba nagsisimula yan? Why can't we have a culture of peace here? No, culture is that feeling. So is the way of how things are being done. No? So there is culture in the workplace. And when we say culture of peace here, our country, is it here? Do we have a culture of peace? And who leads to show that there is a culture of peace? We have to look at our leaders, no? So our leaders embodying the culture of peace. Okay. So um this is a comparison between culture of war and culture of peace. So the culture of war and violence, okay, so we have an enemy, diba? And the government should be authoritarian, right? There are secrets. We don't tell the people right away what are our plans, no? So the policies and the protocols are so within the box. No, there's no area for consideration. There's no area for context, right? And usually there's a male domination, what they call strong man politics, diba? So yeah, so that is the culture of war and violence. Well, there's a culture of peace, no? So we are very conscious about it in education. And then we know that there's a culture of peace when we are tolerant, no? When we are in solidarity. So of course we have these mga monthly celebrations, no? Like right now we have Pride Month, and during Pride Month we try to be in solidarity with those who are marginalized um according to their gender preferences, diba? So and then we have, for example, months that celebrate violence against women. So we're not saying that we should only think about these problems during that month, but this month, like, sort of are markers or like ways for us to commemorate. But when we want to have a culture, it should be year round and every day, right? So yeah, so we know that there's a culture of peace if there's free flow information. So and when you say free flow of information, of course, not free flow of disinformation, but free flow of facts. And do we have access to the facts? No, do we have access to the policies, right? So let's say, for example, if you um this whole issue, problem natin with delayed flights or canceled flights. So what does a person need to do? What does a passenger need to do? Are you aware of your rights, right? So if you don't have that, if you don't have that immediately, if that's not in your immediate access, then that is a symptom of a lack of culture of peace. Diba? Kasi hindi ka peaceful. Eh. What am I going to do? So see, the culture of peace also is from within. No? are we thinking about human rights? No, um, so do when we say he's a rapist, he doesn't need to live. No, so those are the very big questions, no, that are bombarding us when we talk about human rights. It's a very complicated issue. So yeah, no, and then again, like I mentioned earlier, sustainable development, okay, and that is really when there's something being or some groups being marginalized, then we should really rethink development. Okay. So conflict sensitive journalism, okay, is it's conflict sensitivity, and the important word here is journalism. Because every day when you watch the news, what do you see on the evening news, di ba? Motorsiklo nabangga, 5 patay, or bus nahulog sa bangin, 6 patay. Di ba? So parang patay, patay, patay. No? So it's a very violent reporting. And may I ask you, are you familiar or are you aware of good news, okay, development news, di ba? That's happening around. But here's the thing about development news also, because sometimes it could also sound like propagandistic, di ba? So for example, you have a development news on the bridge in Cebu. So there's a very lovely picture of the bridge there, no? It really, wow, makes us look so parang state of the art. The progress is really coming to us here in the Philippines. But if you don't do conflict analysis, no, you will not um, ever think, or you'll not be aware that there are some people marginalized from that project. So again, conflict sensitivity is not being anti-development, but it's just really before we even do something, no, we have to think about who else are being affected before we do this. So conflict sensitive journalism, when we use these tools, it allows us to, for reporters, it allows them to report the conflict or the story in a more balanced way, in a fair way. No? So by using the four tools, which will be introduced to you later by Sir Durf, no? Mas balance, mas makikita mo yung all the other elements, because this framework prevents you from thinking that there are just two sides. Di ba parating ganyan eh? Because that's what we've been told, no? From the very beginning when we were in school before, there's always like the hero and the enemy. Di ba? So there are just two characters. No, there are just no two characters in the story. There are so many characters in the story, and their voices need to be heard. And that's what we teach in conflict sensitive journalism. Okay. So, all right. So this will be further explained to you later when during the conflict analysis tools lecture. Okay. So the whole point of conflict sensitive journalism is when we started teaching about this, or when this was introduced here in Mindanao to MEM, the context was, of course, Mindanao as being a place where there are obvious conflicts. So the whole point was to integrate this subject into school so that it would lead to peace building or peace education. Okay. And so this book teaches about violence, no? Direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. Okay. All right. So when we talk about violence, no, so the directly observable is, for example, what you saw, like the girl was killed, but why was the girl killed? What was the cultural causes of that? No, let's say for example, the this recent news, no, in Davao, where there was this woman, a helper, who was killed and left her body on the pavement by allegedly by this older woman. But usually media just tells us that there was this woman who killed this girl, poor girl, so we all hate that woman and we feel pity for the girl. All right. CSJ doesn't mean that we don't think about the crime that's been happened, but we go deeper, because why are these things happening? Why was it possible for that old woman to get away with murder, at least for that night, diba? What prompted her to kill, no, to kill that poor girl? So there are cultural and structural reason causes to that. So if you're doing a CSJ lens, or if you're using a CSJ framework, then you can really analyze that and understand more, because stories just don't happen in silos, right? So if we're saying na, let's say for example, okay, somebody died. All right, next story. But this keeps on happening, no? And this is becoming a trend now in Davao. So what is happening? So tayo as citizens, we must have that lens and think about what is causing this, no? Why are people now becoming more emboldened, no, and brave to do heinous crimes? Okay, all right. Uh, Let me just double check. Is somebody's mic turned on? Can we turn off our microphones? Okay, because I can see here a buzzing. Okay, thank you for that. All right. So another example, okay, for example, sexual violence on a girl, no? And then why are we saying what's the cause? What's the cause of this rampant raping? So possibly, no, we could analyze that there is a prevailing misogynist attitude, no? And like I said, there is this fear of speaking out, no, that might shame the family. So a lot of times, and we've seen this in many documentaries and in many narratives, no, many girls, many women have suffered through domestic violence, suffered through rape, no, at a date rape or rape by their peers, by their friends, by their male friends, and they wouldn't speak up. Why is that? Why is that woman not not brave enough to talk about? And there is a cultural cost to that, as well as structural cost. So when you so we'll talk more about that later, no? So I don't want to jump the gun. All right. So peace journalism naman, okay, what's the difference between CSJ and peace journalism? So if again, conflict sensitive journalism is about analyzing the conflict, okay? Peace journalism, all right, originally developed by Johan Galtung, is an attempt to correct the media's tendency to practice war journalism. All right. So they're almost the same. All right. But again, as we have mentioned earlier, the difference of the two is that conflict sensitive journalism looks at analyzes the conflict first, all right? Whereas peace jockey, it involves reporting that promotes alternatives. All right. So see the difference? So in CSJ, when you have a CSJ lens, okay, not just a reporter, but as a reader, you're thinking about the causes. But in Peace Journey, you're now reporting or you're now promoting alternatives. Okay, so continuous and effective practice of PJ or peace journalism can help the society think and speak about non-violence and creativity when dealing with conflicts. All right. So Peleg laid out the peace journalism model, no, as seen here. All right. So what is the difference between peace and peace journalism and war journalism? So again, war journalism focuses on it's an all-out war. The goal is to win the war regardless. Diba? Regardless who gets killed, you know, in the line of fire. Okay, so that's war. That's all the reporting is all about. Whereas like conflict sensitive journalism, you also explore the conflict formation. Okay, but again, we give voice. It's giving voice to all parties, right? And it humanizes all sides. But like I mentioned earlier, peace journalism gives options. Okay, so that's the difference here. See, it's proactive, okay, and prevention before any violence war occurs. So peace journalism is really more of an intervention, okay, than a step forward from conflict sensitive journalism. Okay. So this was acknowledged, no? Theodora acknowledged the criticisms against PJ, which are heavily anchored on the so-called lack of objectivity. Okay. This is because PG involve a conscious effort of selecting stories that create opportunities for the public to consider non-violent resolutions to conflicts. All right. So, but this is not a mirror of reality. No, Theodore said the concept of objectivity is misleading because journalism by itself is not a mirror of reality, but representation of it. How is that? Because remember, as reporters, as content creators, we all have a lens, we all have an agenda. Okay. And whenever we create something, we decide what to put. Okay. So there's really no objectivity there. No, there is always sabi, media bias. Well, the truth of the matter is everyone's biased, but it's an acknowledgement and awareness of your biases that makes you more of a critical thinker, and a person who is more attuned to peace, okay, but in a humanized way, di ba? Kasi it's so easy to say, we want to have peace, but without really understanding where the conflict is coming from, right? So in current practice, subjectivity is observed when the media chooses to emphasize one set of facts over the others, right? So that's what I mentioned earlier. So, all right. So peace journalism does not favor any party, just like conflict sensitive journalism. It seeks to look into all sides. Okay. So Lynch and McGoldrick now recognize the importance of objectivity in journalism. That when you go out into there's an actual war now or conflict, and the importance of objectivity in journalism. No, this might strictly adhere to this principle that may fuel violence. Okay, so they give examples of the types of highly objective news that can trigger violence, overtly favors official sources, obviously bias in favor of events over the process, and favors dualism in reporting conflict. So, ito yung tinatawag natin duomanicism that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so because to put it simply, but the reality of it kasi reporters have a deadline, and sometimes it takes so much from them, okay, to really create a complex story. But it's still their responsibility. It's not time is not an excuse, but we recognize that. So that's why a journalist, okay, while he is limited, she is limited, no, the journalists are limited most of the time, no, with time and a lot of constraints. But there should always still be an effort, okay, to limit this or to um disregard or to not use dualism in order to report. Okay. All right. So CSPP communication is not peace journalism. Okay. So the difference is that one cannot practice CSPP communications while also practicing peace journalism. Okay. So peace journalism focuses on reporting alternatives to violence, while CSPP is more purposive and can cater to the needs and agenda, okay, of not just government agencies, but especially here in schools in our context. Okay. So Lynch himself, who developed the PJ model from Galtung, admitted some limitations of PJ. Something could be considered as a practice of peace journalism. This means that something um, it should be about creating opportunities for society to consider and to value non-violent conflict responses. All right. So what is CPP communications again? Lynch made clear that background and context are crucial in reporting conflicts. So basically, all of that, no, from what we have been explaining a while ago, conflict sensitivity and peace joy. Now, when we say communications, that's more of daily life, right? We have communications in school. We have communications between you and your colleagues. You have communications between you and your leaders in school, in your offices, between you and your boss. You have communication between you and your students. So communication happens every day. So this now, CSPP now, is sort of an extension or a contextualization of conflict sensitive journalism and peace journalism. So we put all those elements, okay, get the really good things from all of these frameworks and put it in how we purposely communicate or purposefully communicate with one another. Okay. So ito, all right. So this is still explaining about peace journal. Okay, let me skip that. So again, CSP is also not conflict-sensitive journalism, no? While CSJ focuses on truth-seeking, accuracy, focus on relevance, and good writing. All right. CSPP is, through these concepts, basically it's applied in practice, okay? That people can build their own opinion towards peace. So it's easier to teach journalists to be sensitive in reporting rather than teach them a new methodology. So again, like I said, so not to confuse you, we had conflict sensitive journalism, we had peace journal. We take those and put it into practical purposes in regular communication, organizational communication, government communication, school communication, and that is what we call conflict sensitivity and peace promotion in communication. Okay. All right. Okay. So let me skip this part. All right. Okay, so given these observations, so CSPP communications can be defined as a discipline in purposive communication that can be characterized by the heavy use of conflict analysis. So nun pa rin yung conflict analysis. Okay, still very important. Because it's really how we should approach stories. So again, conflict analysis is not just a tool for reporters, but us citizens. So while we are bombarded every day with this information, with so many with unexplained or so complex issues in front of us, when we have that lens of conflict analysis, it helps us understand and makes us, you know, gives us space towards peace building. Kasi naintindihan na natin where people are coming from, di ba? So again, it's really about getting out of our silos and thinking more of the other person and doing a do no harm approach.